The reality of being triggered. Being triggered is a really interesting term. For those of us who have experienced trauma, we understand how deeply impactful it can be. When you are triggered, it can completely derail your day, completely, depending on what has happened. But then we can also be triggered and have like this tiny little glitch, this little inconvenience. And it's interesting. And I'm not sure whether we have this conversation enough because there are people out there who use the word triggered very loosely and without understanding what it is to be triggered and what it actually means. And I want to speak to this for a moment. I think if you're here listening to this, you've obviously experienced trauma, so you understand what it is to be triggered. If you're new to my community and maybe you haven't experienced trauma, there's just one thing I saw on it was Instagram, an interview the other week actually, where there was a father talking about his daughter, and he was basically criticizing his daughter for using the term triggered. And she had from memory, she had asked to do something. She said, I want to do this. And her parents said no. And her response was something like, this is so triggering. You're triggering me, guys. I'm so triggered by this. And her dad called her out. He said in this interview, he turned around and was like, what could have possibly happened to you for this to be triggering? What is triggering to you about this situation? And he said, she comes from a very emotionally stable home, has been supported, she hasn't had any significant trauma, and, she's throwing this word out. And she sort of gave these examples, and she's like, well, you're not letting me do this, and I wanted to do this. To which her dad turned around and went, you're inconvenienced, you're upset, you're probably even angry, but you're not triggered. So don't use that term when it's not appropriate. And I kind of agree. I certainly don't want to dismiss how people are feeling and thinking and that kind of thing. But in this situation, she wasn't being triggered. She was annoyed because she didn't get her own way, right? It's almost this sense of entitlement. And I've seen that a lot with some people where, it's like this throw off comment. They're inconvenienced or they don't get their own way. And they're like, oh, I'm so triggered. It's like, no, you're not. You're just being a brat, right? You're just inconvenienced. You're just upset. That's not the same, right? It's I don't know. I don't know how it got to this point. I don't know if it became some catchphrase where if we say this, then we'll get more attention or what it is. But this episode is not about that. I'm not here to talk about you being upset or not getting your own way because everyone goes through periods where they don't get their own way. Right? That's part of life. That's part of growing. It's part of being human. And I just wanted to mention that and shine light on it because there are quite a lot of people who say they're triggered and they're not triggered. I'm also not trying to be dismissive or disrespectful or rude. And there are obviously going to be times where someone says they're triggered, and of course they are, right? It's a fine line. It's a fine line. But if you have experienced trauma and healed, you will have been triggered. And for the rest of your life, probably, you will continue to be triggered. And maybe, as I said earlier, sometimes it will feel really big and hard and challenging, and other times it's just a little inconvenience. And in the wise words of my dear friend Karen Johnson, her and I were having a conversation about, life after trauma the other week. She's like, we're all just fucked. And it's true. We are. We're all just fucked. And, you know, if you take offense to that, then this is probably not the community for you, and I'm not the coach for you. But in a way, we just go through these moments where we're going to be triggered. Trying to pretend that you will not be triggered once you've healed is setting yourself up for failure, right? In fact, it is probably more likely to put you in a huge giant hole when you are triggered than, being like, you know what, I've got flaws. I've got shit that comes up, shit that affects me. It's going to happen. right? So if you remain open, present, and compassionate, you're going to be able to navigate your triggers with so much more ease, grace, and flow. Again, not to say it's not going to be messy or challenging. That's what messaging is, a combination between messy and challenging. I'm not saying it's not going to be messy or challenging or hard, but if you choose courage and compassion over judgment and criticism and denial, you're going to be able to move through the trigger a hell of a lot easier. About 6 months ago, I was triggered really badly, really badly. I had a stalker when I was 23, which went on for about 12 months. I reported it to the police quite early on, and they didn't do anything about it. They told me there was nothing they could do. And it was only after I joined the police force that it was taken seriously. The man who was stalking me was arrested, charged, went through the court process. I don't think he got anything, surprise, surprise. But at least it validated what I was feeling. I felt heard. Whereas previously, I'm like, this person is harassing me at the very least, and you're not doing anything about it. Also mindful that police, in my opinion, no, not in my opinion, police do not have proper training on stalking. Right, I'm just going to put it out there. Police don't have the proper training on stalking. Um, and it's ridiculous. It is one of the most dismissed offenses, in my opinion, and also one of the most harmful, emotionally harmful. And it fucking fries my brain that when you're in the police force, it's taught as a crime and you learn like the points of proof and that's it. I undertook a lot of trainings when I was working at the university on, stalker risk profiling and, the habits and patterns and that kind of stuff. And it just, anyway, side note, should be taught to all police. Um, and I thought I dealt with that. I've done a lot of work. I've done a lot of healing. I thought I had done everything that I needed to do to have accepted it and to be at a point where it wouldn't resurface again, where I wouldn't be triggered by anything like that again. Then I had a situation about 6 months ago that left me feeling like someone was stalking me. The feeling that I had in that moment was the feeling that I had had years ago that I had carried for 12 months. And it threw me. It started with one conversation I know with someone reached out to me and said something, and I was like, it threw me. And you can tell, like, I'm quite emotional thinking about it right now, but I freaked out. I got in the shower. I remember I was doing a meditation out under our big tree at our house, and I'd had a message with someone just checking on me. And I was like, what are they talking about? And then I looked at a couple of things and just lost it. And I got in the shower and I was sobbing, like uncontrollably sobbing. And I called my partner Chris and he's like, what has happened? I'm like, oh my God, I can't deal with this. And I was telling him and I don't know if he's ever seen me that upset or he didn't see me or heard me like that emotional because of this. And his response to his, I gotta love him. He was like, you can take him, babe. Not that I ever thought it was going to come to fisticuffs, but yeah, he was like, you can take him. But then he saw how much I was affected and he was there. He was there for me. And it took me a couple of days, if I'm honest, to like recenter and regroup and, come back to me. And that's probably like the worst I've been triggered in a really long time. I've been emotional over things and I've had, slight triggers, but this was like, a couple of days. That's a big trigger. It's a big trigger for me. And yeah, as I said, it threw me. I journaled, I breathed through it. I spent a lot of time out in nature and I let it go. And I collected myself and allowed myself just to go through it, to see it for what it was. because if I didn't, I would have been held in that for a lot longer. So I had the option of pretending that I wasn't triggered when I was and prolonging that experience, or to just be really, really uncomfortable for a couple of days and allow myself to let that move through. I knew that the situation that I was in was not the same, but that doesn't, just because we logically know that it's not the same, or we logically know that we're not in danger, doesn't mean that our body and our mind aren't going to have that emotional reaction, right? That we don't have that response. And trying to pretend when you have been through something traumatic, trying to pretend that there is nothing in this world that can trigger you is, as I said earlier, just, well, I didn't say this earlier, but it's just dumb. It's dumb because I could have been really consumed by what happened. And as I said, I could have pretended that it wasn't happening and tried to avoid it or soldier on. But I know that down the track, it would have come back again. So I had to face it. I had to just be with it. And being with it was horrible, horrible. And you can tell from even by how emotional I got just talking about it, there's still, residual emotions there. And this is an extreme example, but I'm giving you a really extreme example of what the reality can be. I have also been triggered by TV, TV shows and movies, by people's content on social media. But Instagram is like a real cesspool for triggers if you follow the right or wrong people. I've been triggered by situations that have happened. I've been triggered by clients. I've been triggered by coaches. I've been triggered by family. And the bottom line is you just can't predict what will trigger you. I have had some of the people that I adore and respect and value most in this world trigger me. And it's really uncomfortable. I've had some really uncomfortable conversations with people that I love because I've been triggered by them. And when we have these conversations, I'm not doing it to blame them, but I'm not saying like, oh, you triggered me and you shouldn't have done this. That's not what it's about. It's about acknowledging what's going on for me. And there's been situations where if I didn't say something, that relationship would have been impacted. And I didn't want that. So I said it. I explained what was going on. And of course, they understood and we had this beautiful conversation about it. And that's the thing. Often when we can have conversations about being triggered and it be this really beautiful, heartfelt, expansive experience. Or depending on who it is, we can try and have this conversation and feel shut down and rejected. I've had both. I have had both. When I think about this, obviously, if you are deep, like in the thick of something at the moment, whether it is something that is traumatic or deep in your healing, there is a strong likelihood that similar situations will be a trigger, right? So if you can avoid these for the time being, right? So if you're in the thick of something, let's do an example off the top of my head. If you are in the process of, if you're in a domestic violent relationship or if you're in the process of leaving a violent relationship, don't watch It Ends With Us, right? The movie. Don't watch it. It's going to trigger you, right? It triggered me. And my domestic violence relationship was 15 years ago, 16 years ago, right? So don't do that. Don't intentionally put yourself in situations that you know are going to trigger you when you are really heightened and sensitive. In saying that, there might be situations that you choose to put yourself in to be triggered as a way of healing, which sounds pretty messed up. Sounds pretty messed up to go, oh, I know this is going to trigger me, so I'm going to do it anyway. But again, sometimes that can be one of the most expansive things, right? One of those, if we're rolling with the domestic violence thing, one of your things in part of your healing might be to have a conversation or confront that person or explain something to that person, knowing that they're going to come back with something that's going to trigger you. So you're choosing to trigger yourself, but as a way of healing and moving forward. It sounds complex. Don't have, you obviously don't have to, you never have to choose to be triggered or choose to put yourself in a situation that you know is going to trigger you. But fundamentally, the reality of being triggered is that there will be moments in your life that trigger you. And what is more important is that you don't make yourself wrong for it. You don't tell yourself you're stupid. You don't downplay it. You don't have to make it bigger than what it is, but you also don't have to minimize. And you should never minimize how you're feeling because how you're feeling is how you're feeling. Right? I'm going to say that again. How you're feeling is how you're feeling. Just because other people might not understand, it doesn't mean that that's not your experience, right? So allow yourself to work through it. Allow yourself to work through it because that is the only way to move past it. You know, you have to acknowledge what has triggered you, connect with where that trigger comes from because sometimes it's really obvious and sometimes it's not. You know, I've been triggered. I'm like, I'm not, this has triggered me and I don't know, I don't like it. Initially, I'm like, I don't actually understand where this has come from. But then when I look at it, I'm like, oh, there it is. You know, process the emotions or the feelings that come up when you're triggered. If you take nothing else away from this, like please nurture and take care of yourself when you are being triggered or when you are triggered. You know, you need to look after yourself. You need to prioritize yourself. And that might include cleansing, whether it's having a shower or jumping in the pool or the beach or the river or, you know, whatever you need. Maybe it's going out and hugging a tree. And some people might laugh at that, but I'm actually quite serious. I often go down and hug our big tree because it's got some wild energy, our big tree. But most importantly, like please give yourself space for your nervous system to settle before you try and soldier on, before you try and move forward. Because if you think about being triggered, I'm thinking I had this visual in my head, bear with me, of I grew up in country Victoria and the river, and some parts of the river are quite muddy. And when everything is settled, the water is kind of clear. But then if you stand in the mud, you just kind of see all like the mud particles, like just dirties the water. And if you think about being triggered as that, so your foot comes down, all of the mud particles come up, that's you being triggered, your emotions, your feelings, the energy. We take time. You need to take time for that to settle, for the water to become clear again before you can, you know, continue as you were. This doesn't mean that when you're triggered, you have to lock yourself in the room until, you know, everything's 100% normal again. Not saying that. I'm just saying, like, when you're heightened, take some time, take some space, let your nervous system resettle before you move on. You know, the other week I had it felt like bad news, but there was a lot of unknowns with it. And I wasn't triggered, but it was a lot. I felt like a lot in that moment. And I remember sitting in my office and I was trying to do some work and I was just getting nothing done. So I took the day off. I was like, do you know what? I just can't do anything that requires me to be actively on because my nervous system is not here, right? We have to nurture our nervous system always. To me, every time I am triggered and have been triggered, I am given the opportunity to grow, to learn, to expand. It's not always comfortable, right? I just explained a very uncomfortable situation that I went through. But moving through that, you know, I learned so much. My resilience has improved, my compassion and my understanding for myself. But most of all, there's this underlying lesson, or lesson's the wrong word. For me, when I think about that experience, I was like, do you know what? There were things that I probably saw that coming and I didn't listen to my intuition. So there's lessons in that, right? I have expanded and grown because of that experience. it has given me permission to change some things. And for that, I'm grateful. And again, me being triggered by someone else isn't anything about them, right? It's not about them, it's about me. This was my emotional response to what was happening. And it's up to me to then work through that and choose to use it as a lesson, use it as something that is supportive over something that's going to make me completely shut down. And when I look at that, if me experiencing discomfort allows for greater capacity to support you, which it does, then I'm here for it. Every time I'm triggered, my capacity grows. And that's a fucking gift. If you take nothing away from this episode other than that, let it be that. That every time you're triggered and you work through it, your capacity grows. You learn more about yourself. You become more compassionate and you become a better human, in my opinion. And remember, in the wise words of my dear, dear friend, we're all just fucked.